This video's going to be a very complicated one, so let's just start at the very beginning. The Spanish-American revolutions during the early 19th century came about from a ton of economic, socio-political, and geopolitical pressures that fundamentally destabilized Spain's grip on its American colonies. These revolutions are nearly impossible to boil down into a short history segment like this, something you guys dutifully pointed out in my Mexican superpower video, which I appreciate. As I say at the end of videos, please leave your critiques in the comments because, again, I'm just one guy working off the sources I come across, and the thousands of you all from the audience likely have a better grasp at one topic or another than I do, jumping around from historical period to historical period each week. Anyway, in order to try and briefly summarize the revolutions against Spain, we're going to have to make some major generalizations. And the first is that there was generally a racial hierarchy in the Spanish-American colonies, which is sometimes referred to as the casta system. The system was different in different colonies. For example, in modern-day Peru and Bolivia, it was harsher because there were more natives than, say, Central America or Hispaniola. It also differed depending on the amount of imported African slaves, like in the Caribbean, where high mortality rate sugar plantations economically demanded the importation of more cheap or no-cost labor from Africa. It was a morbid reality, but it was also not a uniform system across all of the colonies, and treated natives, but also mestizos and criollos, or ethnic Spaniards born in the Americas, differently depending on the circumstances. Anyway, typically at the apex of this social hierarchy, this casta system, were the peninsulares, who were the elite ruling class and were born in Spain. Then you had the aforementioned criollos, who themselves would find themselves excluded from the high-ranking offices of new Spanish territories, despite really compromising a good majority, or at least plurality, of the wealth and influence of the people in these colonies. Below these groups, there were the mestizos, or mixed-race people, the indios, or natives, and then the enslaved Africans. Mestizos were kind of the middle ground, and their treatment was dependent on the local conditions of where they lived, but the natives were often sort of dealt a hand of tribute systems and land displacement, and in some cases, though this was more prevalent earlier in Spanish colonization, they would be the slaves themselves. After a large portion of the native populations died out, African slaves formed the backbone of agricultural economies in regions like Venezuela, Colombia, and the Caribbean. So anyway, during the 18th and 19th centuries, the Spanish were changing the way that they ruled their colonies with periods like the Bourbon reforms. And these changes reduced the criollos' influence, again, the powerful ethnic Spaniards who were born in the New World. On top of that, mercantilist policies imposed by Spain mandated that the colonies trade exclusively with the metropole, Spain, often at unfavorable terms. The local economies were thus tethered to raw material exports of things like silver, cacao, and sugar, while finished goods had to be imported from Spain proper. And this dependency hurt the colony's economic diversification, and it enriched the peninsular elite at the expense of locals, including these wealthy criollos. Meanwhile, Spain's incessant taxation, including customs duties and sales taxes, weighed heavily on colonial economies. So all of these policies hurt these elites who were born in the New World, who felt tethered to the land, that they had a special connection and stewardship that these Spaniards who were born across the ocean didn't have. And once the Napoleonic Wars erupted and Spain proper became distracted, many of these Criollo elites seized the opportunity and decided that they would be better suited to rule the New World than Spain. In 1808, Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Spain and deposed King Ferdinand VII and installed his brother Joseph Bonaparte on the throne. This delegitimized the Spanish monarchy, and while there certainly were some criollos and of course peninsulares who wanted Ferdinand reinstated, the more vocal, and in some instances more powerful ones, were in favor of independence. The first major revolutionary movements began in 1810, spurred by the power vacuum. In Venezuela, a criollo-dominated junta declared independence, marking the start of the Venezuelan War of Independence. From Buenos Aires to Mexico City, other revolts followed suit. However, these early revolts were fragmented and fraught with internal divisions, some ideological and some even ethnic. Many criollos, it was viewed, wanted independence only for themselves, sidelining the mestizo and indio majorities. But then, of course, the northern revolutions gained momentum under the leadership of Simón Bolívar, known as El Libertador. Born into a wealthy Creole family in Venezuela, Bolívar combines some of the Enlightenment ideals he grew up around in the wake of the Enlightenment and American Revolution with military acumen from his time as a student in Spain and a vision of continental unity. He led campaigns in Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru that were instrumental in dismantling Spanish rule in northern South America. But as I mentioned, Bolívar's political vision extended beyond just independence. He wanted to create a unified federation of former Spanish colonies, believing that unity was essential to resisting foreign domination and fostering stability in the New World. In his letter from Jamaica in 1815, Bolívar articulated his vision of a unified Spanish America, arguing that only through unity could the newly independent nations achieve true sovereignty. Bolívar was heavily inspired by people like Francisco de Miranda, often regarded as his intellectual precursor. The concept then began in physical form with the establishment of Gran Colombia in 1821, encompassing modern-day Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, and Panama. However, Bolívar also had acknowledged in the letter that his vision was actually impossible, which is why instead he turned to developing Gran Colombia and collaborating with other revolutionaries further south in the creation of states like Peru or Bolivia, named after Bolívar. The southern revolutions were led by similarly motivated figures like José de San Martín and Bernardo O'Higgins. San Martin's military genius liberated Argentina, Peru, and, along with O'Higgins, Chile, all culminating in the occupation of Lima in 1821. And unlike Bolívar, San Martín favored a more decentralized approach to governance and actually ceded leadership of the Peruvian campaign to Bolívar after their historic meeting in Guayaquil in 1822, which then led the groundwork for the Peru-Bolivian Confederation established later in 1836. But as mentioned, the revolutions were still plagued by internal divisions that hindered this cohesion that Bolívar wanted to manifest into a united state. Besides the persistence of the social hierarchy after the revolutions, to a degree, in certain societies wherein Criollo elites prioritized their own interests over those of the broader population, the Indios and many mestizos refused to join the efforts because of the Criollo elites, and sometimes even led counter-revolutions. Then there's the geographic and logistical challenges of the Spanish New World. While regional identities often took precedence over a shared Bolivarian or Spanish American identity, Bolívar still wanted, in the back of his mind, to realize this vision, though. To that end, he convened the Congress of Panama in 1826, which was meant to establish a framework for cooperation among the new republics, including the Central American Republic, which I haven't yet mentioned. However, the Congress achieved really little because of those regional rivalries and because a handful of states just didn't even show up. Mexico arrived but didn't sign the treaty. Bolivia and the United States were supposed to arrive but didn't actually show up. Brazil, too, was meant to show up but changed their minds at the last minute. Chile and Rio de la Plata refused outright. Paraguay and Haiti weren't even invited. And of course, Cuba and Puerto Rico were still under Spanish control. So in the end, only Gran Colombia, the organizer of the Congress, signed the Treaty of Union, League, and Perpetual Confederation, and then dissolved in 1831 after Ecuador seceded and started a chain reaction. As we know, of course, the United States and Brazil would end up going their own directions, while the Latin American states would change and evolve into the polities they are today, still heavily influenced by these initial revolutions and figures like Bolívar and San Martín, but as we can likely tell, not exactly united. But what if all of that had changed? What if, in an alternate timeline, somehow the Panama Congress achieved Bolívar's goal and united the Hispanic countries into a Patria Grande? Before beginning today's alternate history scenario, be sure to leave a comment and subscribe. If you want to help support our content, you can watch through our extensive catalog of videos, or consider joining the channel like our first and current member, Eaglefall. You can also submit a scenario in our official Discord server linked below. Anyway, thanks and enjoy the video. Alright, so Patria Grande is inherently a radical concept. Just like some refer to the United States of America as an experiment in its time, Patria Grande would too certainly be something of a political experiment. Now, a major reason unification failed in the first place among such a huge and massive swath of territory was because Simón Bolívar wanted a centralized government instead of a federalized system. There's certainly a possibility that if he was more open to decentralization and a more regional autonomy, kind of like San Martin, Gran Colombia could have been something of the United States of Latin America. But of course, there are a lot of other issues to tackle. Spanish colonial America, as we discussed in the Mexican superpower video, had more systematically entrenched economic and political systems than the hierarchies in the United States, which prevented these Latin American nations, including actually the Empire of Brazil, obviously for different reasons than the others, from growing and industrializing at the same rapid pace that the United States did. So while a unified federal system is in theory possible, it would have been very nepotistic and struggled to economically develop to counter the weight of the United States' grip on the Americas. This would be exacerbated by the fact that most of these former colonies were, at this point, poor and stuck in a resource extraction export economy and would, should Patria Grande form, all be lumped together and sharing in their economic issues. This would, in effect, turn out to either be the greatest strength or the greatest weakness of this Patria Grande, besides maybe rampant corruption. In the case that Hispanic America unites into this Patria Grande and still retains this economic struggle against nepotism and corruption towards industrialization and manufacturing economies that never really materialize, I imagine there would have been a lot less military coups, but the social structures and economic issues wouldn't have been much different, and possibly worse, with states interfering in one another's autonomy. What this situation would give you is a Patria Grande that is essentially economically tied to the United States or Britain, exporting raw materials to these industrial states in return for processed goods. No better than their colonial system, just with a bit of profit. This arrangement would certainly make the United States and Britain very, very wealthy, with essentially a new massive market for their goods, but this wouldn't necessarily help the economic standings of Hispanic America so much. Material quality of life might incrementally improve, as it had in other markets that received British or American goods like India or South Africa or Germany before it quickly industrialized, but the economic mobility wouldn't improve, and as the examples of India and South Africa show us, if the market gets disrupted, or America or Britain suffer or even pull out of their economic arrangements, the artificial living standards drop and you have a social crisis. So this is not the position we want Patria Grande to grow into. We want Patria Grande to become self-sufficient. This is something the Brazilian monarchy tried and failed to achieve, and as we know, something the United States quickly achieved. But besides the economic issues, there's also actually a cultural issue, which some who aren't familiar with Latin America might not necessarily pick up on. The only thing that most every polity or ethnic group in Hispanic America shares is the Spanish language, which is already heavily regionalized, and the Catholic faith. And in almost every other cultural regard, the Hispanic American ethnicities are very different. Bolivia and Peru are shaped more by their native roots. Mexico is influenced way more by Central and Eastern European, particularly Polish and Austrian cultural influences, while of course the Caribbean has its Afro-Caribbean cultural influence. Chile and Argentina are, well, Chile and Argentina. And everything from music to customs to food to their main resource exports are different across the different ethnicities of Latin America. Now, is this a huge problem? That's debatable. The idea that cultural differences would doom this Patria Grande is certainly not, for lack of a better phrasing, set in stone. Although regional dialects of Spanish and local traditions vary, these differences pale in comparison to those found in other multi-ethnic unions like India or Indonesia, where they don't even have a unified religion and language. While India has experienced ethnic and sectarian violence, it remains united as a federal republic. And while Indonesia is certainly dealing with issues like West Papua, it too is relatively stable of a state in Southeast Asia, especially compared to contemporaries like Myanmar or Laos or Bangladesh. We could perhaps then compare this situation to a very, very rudimentary version of the United States under the Articles of Confederation or the European Union. All that is to say, a confederal model for Patria Grande granting significant autonomy to member states would avoid over-centralization and mitigate some of the political fractures we've seen in other countries which have tried this before, like the Arab Confederation and the like. So the only way this Patria Grande would work is as a confederation in which pretty much all the states or republics, or whatever we end up calling the polities that make up the confederation, are free to do almost whatever they want, perhaps using retrospective understandings of the Articles of Confederation, why they failed, and how they can be successfully applied to Hispanic America as a model. Ironically enough, greater state autonomy, which the Articles of Confederation brought, which nearly crippled America as a state, would be absolutely necessary for this Patria Grande to work, of course with the exception of regional militaries, and a sort of necessary attempt at ensuring the economies of the different states aren't heavily disjointed. All this is to say, basically, we need a confederal model, but essential currency and a unified military are definitely necessities, and of course, run against the Articles model, and perhaps a Congress of sorts in the proposed capital of Panama to decide foreign policy. But beyond this, it's really important that the individual polities have political and cultural autonomy and the ability to let themselves rule themselves so that we don't end up with another series of coups and secession crises. There is another little issue before we move on, and that is how Patria Grande is going to deal with the Indios, or the native peoples. Indio cultures and languages are, in some instances, a more integral part of Latin American regional identities, more so in places like Bolivia or Guatemala than central Mexico or Panama or Chile. And now, while they would not pose a significant barrier to the formation of Patria Grande itself, because whether or not the nation formed was up to the governments at the Panama Congress, I guess it would still be a question that Patria Grande would have to answer. The easiest answer is to relinquish the task to the regional polities, but more so the reason I'm examining this question is whether or not during the formation of Patria Grande, if, for example, they respect Ecuadorians as an independent polity from what was Gran Colombia and take that into consideration when dividing the Union into federated states, how would they consider the majority native regions? Now, of course, many Indio populations at this time already spoke Spanish or Portuguese as a primary or secondary language, and had been subject to Christian conversion efforts. And even modern examples such as the Bolivian government under Evo Morales demonstrate that Indios and Indio communities can support larger projects like Bolivarianism and Latin American integration when their interests are represented. However, granting Indio or native regions full autonomy within the Patria Grande that early could create unintended consequences. These regions are often even more reliant on economies of resource extraction, and they would likely remain underdeveloped and dependent on support from the wealthier member states like Mexico and like Peru. This dynamic and its risks kind of mirror the failures of Native American reservations in the United States, where systemic poverty and economic underdevelopment still persist to this day. So without a strong, unified economic strategy to keep these regions from becoming a burden on the other states, supporting semi-autonomous native states could really strain Patria Grande from the start, because these native states wouldn't have the resources or really the drive to push for industrialization and economic diversification along with the other states. I think at least the question of natives would ultimately be sidelined by the Criollo elites who were at the Panama Congress, even if it got brought up. After all, they probably wouldn't care about the Indio autonomy, but might just try to weaken the social boundaries that prevented them from economic prosperity, out of an Enlightenment ideological route of sorts. So with some of our preliminary conceptual questions sort of answered, let's get into the actual scenario. We'll assume that somehow the Congress of Panama succeeds in creating a functional Patria Grande by adopting again a confederal model. Obviously, this is not at all realistic. Rio de la Plata, Chile, Mexico, Peru, and the Central American Republic didn't want to join Gran Colombia. But for the sake of the scenario, we'll assume that somehow all of these states just magically elect to sign the Treaty of Union League and Perpetual Confederation. The United States, Empire of Brazil, and British Empire would also all be at the Congress of Panama, with the British having sent observers and the Americans and Brazilians having been invited to sign. It would, though, probably be too much of a stretch to imagine the United States of America and Empire of Brazil joining Patria Grande due to the linguistic, racial, and, in the case of the United States, religious differences. It's already absurd to assume all of the Hispanic American countries who just fought for their own independence and had their own home rule and governmental systems would swear allegiance to this new United Confederation, but again, we're just going with it. So the Treaty of Union would establish essentially a framework that keeps the regional governments intact, but takes the issues of military organization, defense, and foreign policy, and places this in the hands of the capital government in Panama City, the geographic and symbolic center of the Confederation, and Bolivar's proposed capital. With the regional governments intact, just under the umbrella of the Patria Grande, the government in Panama would have four wings. The first being a Confederate Assembly, a legislative body with proportional representatives from each member state, which would control the military, defense, and foreign policy. In this way, a general consensus by the Congress would be needed to declare war or approve major military actions. Well, of course, the military hierarchy itself would have control over its internal affairs. Now, this Congress could certainly result in gridlock in a time of war, so there would also be a rotating presidency at the insistence of Bolívar, wherein executive leadership would rotate among member states every 2 years, with Bolívar himself serving for the first 6 to ensure stability. The role of the president would actually be more like that of a prime minister, presiding over congressional sessions and acting as the face of the Union in diplomatic affairs abroad. A confederal Supreme Court would also be established to resolve disputes between the states and ensure adherence to the treaty. And finally, the Confederation would integrate a unified army and navy with regional commands to address local security concerns, whose mandates would be, again, dictated by the Confederate Assembly. For fun, I'd like to think that perhaps the armed forces might adapt the Guerra a Muerte flag created during Venezuela's wars against Spain in response to the massacres and crimes committed by the Spanish soldiers after the fall of the First Venezuelan Republic. The decree that created the flag sought to redefine the conflict between Venezuela and Spain as an international one involving all of the American nations as a symbol of patriotism and pride in the independence of the New World. We're also going to have to wave away some of the inter-confederation hostilities. Just like the fact that the Mexican Empire had just invaded El Salvador like 5 years prior, and we'll also just kind of assume the Cisplatin War just kind of fizzles out, not unlike it did on our own timeline with Rio de la Plata winning and the Empire of Brazil becoming destabilized. But then this, of course, wouldn't happen until 2 years after the establishment of Patria Grande in 1828, which would then suggest that the signatories would all have their own militaries still by this point, which would then also bode poorly for the First Central American Civil War and Honduran coup, which would occur only a year or two after the Congress of Panama. Can you see how this is already getting a bit too much out of the gate? Yeah, so in the most unrealistic and typical US sub Z fashion imaginable, we're just going to ignore those conflicts to begin with and assume everything just magically falls in line for Patria Grande to form unimpeded. But in all actuality, it is going to take some concerted effort and probably a bit of overreach from the presidency in order to resolve the budding conflict springing up across Latin America during this time. The Central American disputes, the political instability in Honduras, the disputes between Bolivia and Peru, and between Gran Colombia and Peru, and the Mapuche and Comanche, all of this stuff would have to be hammered out either at the Congress of Panama, when they divide Patria Grande into different states, and also in the Confederate Assembly, where we'd be able to see more of a diplomatic, even if it's hostile in nature, a diplomatic resolution to some of these issues, likely with a lot of political maneuvering from Bolívar and his pan-Latin contemporaries, making different concessions and compromises between feuding groups, either in the assembly or behind the scenes. But beyond the interstate chaos, this new confederation is going to need to work on economics too. The confederation would introduce the Americano, a shared currency that would essentially be based on the crippling effects of the early United States regional currencies and their inability to economically integrate. Thus, regional economies would be able to trade without impediment, much like the Eurozone or the establishment of the US dollar in early America. And, luckily enough, without a serious need to balance currency value inequality due to the relative underdevelopment of the economies of Latin America at the time, we might even say the Americano could adopt the gold standard far earlier, leading it to maybe even be stronger than the US dollar for a short period. A central bank would also need to be established in Panama to control this currency, and the vast gold and silver resources of Mexico and Peru would back it up. Infrastructure development would, as usual, become a priority, with major investments in supports and connections between the vast territories. But these would have to happen with state support, not from the Confederate Assembly, as, again, the Assembly's powers are strictly limited. This does also open up a ton of opportunities for the Supreme Court to gain a lot of power when dealing with cross-state infrastructure development and disputes, not unlike the United States Supreme Court would gain in its early years. Tariffs would also be eliminated within the Confederation, creating a single market, while external tariffs would protect the nascent growing industries that some of the early states wanted to develop. A big early target would be to reduce their reliance on external trade. Bolivar in particular and his ideological camp would begin to develop specialized early industry in Patria Grande, particularly textile production. Keep in mind, all of this is occurring just after the first industrial revolution. So if these efforts are successful, Patria Grande could easily become more self-sufficient by the second industrial revolution and have the capabilities to at least not lag far behind the United States in terms of development. Railroads would of course be an issue with the terrain, especially connecting South and Central America through the Darien Gap. And we'd probably see many lives lost attempting to make this connection, whether it comes to fruition or not. That is, of course, not to mention the Andes Mountains, and the difficulty in connecting places like Lima to La Paz to Santiago de Chile by any means other than ship. Again, it's going to cost a lot of resources and a lot of lives trying to connect major hubs of development by rail through the vast jungles, plateaus, deserts, mountains, and rivers of South, Central, and North America. The Criollo elite would likely also become the economic aristocracy of Patria Grande as industrialization occurs, with the wealth and resources to fund this development. This would center development in certain clusters, like Mexico City or Buenos Aires, though other regions, especially inland territories, might actually remain underdeveloped for decades. We'd probably also end up seeing something of a middle class, dominated by mestizo and criollo populations, and this middle class would very likely be more loyal to their regional states than to the Patria Grande, while the wealthy criollo elite would likely have more of a pan-Latin view of the Confederation. This view would likely lead to a general policy of non-intervention in European affairs, while maybe an active support of independence movements in Cuba, Puerto Rico, Hispaniola, and maybe, but probably not, the Philippines. Only about 20 years after its formation, Patria Grande would encounter its first major geopolitical consideration outside of its own borders. The Dominican Republic would declare its independence in 1844 after years of Haitian rule. This complication would serve as an early test of the Confederation's commitment to this pan-Latin solidarity. Now, Haiti would see Patria Grande as a potential threat to its sovereignty and its role as a refuge for freed slaves. If Patria Grande sought to mediate or intervene, it might, of course, be turned away by the Haitians. But this raises a question. Would Patria Grande find it within her constituency to militarily support Dominican independence against Haitian dominance, or would it remain neutral to avoid regional instability? If it intervenes militarily, this could showcase their naval and logistical capabilities, potentially leading to a stronger presence in the Caribbean. But this would come at the cost of antagonizing Haiti and perhaps alienating Afro-Caribbean populations within their own territory, and also inadvertently drawing the fear and suspicion of the Americans just to the northwest. For the sake of this scenario, we will actually assume that Patria Grande will intervene, and due to a sheer difference in size and military capabilities, the Patria will assert Dominican independence. A referendum will then be held where the Dominican Republic will narrowly elect to join the Patria Grande organization, where it will now be defended from both Haitian and Spanish aggression. The conflict over Hispaniola would likely also shape the development of Patria Grande's naval strategy. Early naval goals would center on ensuring control over the Caribbean Sea, which would be vital for the Confederation's trade routes into the Gulf of Mexico and out to Europe. During its first major conflict, the fledgling navy would, of course, face coordination challenges between the multiple member states contributing forces, as any new military has to do when it's first thrust into battle. But this lack of coordination would certainly be less devastating than in, for example, a European context, due to the shared language. They say the element which made the American, British, and Australian forces so deadly during the World Wars was their shared language and ability to coordinate. And if that's the case, it might just be applied to Patria Grande as well. The Patria would also have to deal with limited industrial capacity for shipbuilding, and relying on outdated vessels for the time. But with such a vast coastline, it's inevitable that naval development would become a focus after this first conflict. Patria Grande would also have to deal with patrolling the Pacific and Atlantic coasts of their domain, but also the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico, and their island territories in the Pacific like the Galapagos and Easter Island. The Navy's primary focus would thus be to enforce any blockades the Patria exerts on other powers, protect merchant ships, and prevent foreign intervention. And so Patria Grande would likely adopt a decentralized regional naval command, not unlike the modern United States, just on a smaller scale, with individual regions maintaining regional commands of fleets while coordinating under a unified strategic doctrine. Now, these regional fleets would not fall under the jurisdiction of local governments like Mexico or Rio de la Plata or Colombia, but would instead be self-contained in a regional command hierarchy within the Patria Navy, who answer to, again, the Confederate Assembly. There would also be, around this time, another thing to consider, and that is the vast northern territories of Mexico. To keep it short, Mexico in our own history had issues populating its borderlands like modern-day Colorado, New Mexico, and Texas, and so they invited Anglo-American settlers to fill this void. But this led to a perception among Americans and British that Mexico couldn't control these territories. And later, after Santa Anna's dictatorship and Santa Anna trying to exert greater power among these Anglo-American settlers, they would declare Texas's independence, and eventually this would cause the Mexican-American War. Now, in this scenario, Patria Grande's massive population could perhaps actually mitigate Mexico's struggle to control its northern territories. First of all, rather than inviting Anglo-American settlers, as Mexico did in our own timeline, they could encourage internal migration, with populations from Central and South America moving northward to settle the sparsely populated regions like Texas, New Mexico, and California, especially if, for whatever reason, there's something of an earlier gold rush. This would alleviate the demographic crisis in northern Mexico, but maybe also cause some tension with newcomers from other parts of the Americas. Regardless, this tension would likely be way less impactful than that of Anglo-American settlers, who, granted, would still find their way into these territories, just not in a majority population. Now, in our own timeline, as mentioned, the Texans revolted because they didn't like Santa Anna's more dictatorial, centralized approach to governing. They, along with the Mexicans in these territories, liked the freedom the Wild West environment brought. But the thing is, Santa Anna's rise to power would probably be disrupted by the existence of Patria Grande. The Confederation's rotating presidency and Confederal Assembly would diminish, though certainly not smite, the likelihood of individual states, like Mexico, falling into cycles of authoritarianism and instability. While Mexico will still face political challenges, the stabilizing influence of the Confederation could prevent the political chaos of the 50 presidents in 30 years era, erasing this prominent idea that Mexico couldn't control its borderlands, which was prevalent among American and British observers, and led partially to President James K. Polk's incitement of the Mexican-American War. In this alternate timeline, the Mexican-American War probably will never occur. With less Anglo-Americans in Texas, there's no British or French diplomatic maneuvering to try to keep Texas independent, and there's no reason for the border between the United States and Mexico to be disputed, giving Zachary Taylor's army no reason to march into Texas in 1846, no reason to spark tensions, and leaving President James K. Polk with no casus belli to start war. Even if Andrew Jackson's famous suggestion that the United States should annex Texas and California remained in the public consciousness, and even if Manifest Destiny was still a considerable force, which it was mostly prompted by this notion that Mexico's borderlands were unstable and ripe for annexation, which wouldn't exist in this alternate timeline, even if all these factors pushing the Americans to want to gain these territories in the West, the United States would be far less likely to risk war with the entirety of Patria Grande over Texas or California. The Polk administration had considered outright annexing the Oregon territories, which they shared with Britain, but out of fear of a sequel to the War of 1812 and another burning Washington, Polk abandoned this notion. Now, Patria Grande's combined military and economic resources, even in its infancy, would far exceed those of Mexico alone, and possibly be as large of a threat to specifically the United States as the British Empire would be, forcing the United States to essentially sit still in this timeline. Now, interestingly enough, the absence of the Mexican-American War would also have profound implications for the careers of figures like Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee, whose careers both began in the Mexican-American War. Now, is it likely that these generals would not be esteemed military commanders because of the absence of this particular conflict? No, but it still might have an effect on their political views. Ulysses S. Grant famously described the Mexican-American War as, quote, one of the most unjust ever waged by a stronger nation against a weaker nation, expressing his strong opposition to the conflict in his memoirs. The seeds for Grant's anti-slavery and more egalitarian human rights commitments were planted early on in his military career during the Mexican-American War, as were his approach to strategy affected by his studying of Zachary Taylor's military leadership during this conflict. But perhaps more stunningly impactful, the Mexican-American War is widely considered to have been if not the significant catalyst in the early stages of Abraham Lincoln's political career, as the, at the time, young Whig's strong opposition to the war, particularly through his spot resolutions in Congress, brought him to national attention and helped establish him as a prominent political figure on the national stage, leading to his eventual election as president. Furthermore, we might not ever see the Republican Party exist at all. The Whig Party, which Lincoln was a part of, became sharply divided over the topic of the Mexican-American War. Anti-war Whigs, like Lincoln, were able to establish themselves as a moral opposition to democratic expansionism. Without the war, this internal Whig divide and Lincoln's role within it might not have crystallized in the same way, if not at all, leaving us essentially with the Democratic Party of Andrew Jackson and the Whig Party of Henry Clay, a much more nationalist, isolationist, protectionist, and progressive party, not in the modern sense of the word, but the Teddy Rooseveltian sense. All of this means that the trajectory of the American Civil War and the leadership on both sides would likely change dramatically. I still believe the American Civil War would happen, because the conflict over slavery was still being answered at this point. But there can be two cases against the Civil War even happening at all. The first being that the Whigs would just compromise with the Southerners some more and find a deal about a long-term phase out of slavery, or perhaps that the Whigs would take the approach that slavery was inevitably going to fall out of fashion eventually, and the other is that perhaps a stronger Latin American confederation could serve to maybe discourage the Southern states from seceding if they fear foreign intervention. But I still believe that in more ways than not, the American Civil War was inevitable and would still occur. Maybe not exactly in the same time or under the same conditions, but for the sake of our scenario, we'll say that it would nonetheless occur and the North would nonetheless win. Beyond this, however, Patria Grande, as it stands in this timeline, has the capability to alter the course of history in the Americas and beyond. Whether it be intervention during the Spanish-American War against Spain in Cuba, Puerto Rico, or the Philippines, a clash with the Americans over Cuba or Oregon, or even a race for influence in the Pacific by way of Hawaii and the Pacific Islands, there's a lot that Patria Grande can change, not to mention the World Wars, and Cold One thereafter. So as always, let me know what you think will happen next. If you enjoyed this video or have any critiques or notes, be sure to leave a comment for the algorithm, and subscribe if you want to see more content like this. You can support us by joining our Discord or by becoming a channel member with the join button below. Thanks for your time. This has been the USFC, signing out.